Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author and English teacher on summer break, getting to read a lot and enjoy a lot of different chats with authors. And on this week's episode, I have Christopher Barnes, and he's going to be talking about his book, Mesa Verde's Secret Garden, A History of Managing the Backcountry and Wilderness of a National Park. Christopher, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, DelSheree. As you said, my name's Chris Barnes. It's nice to be back here. I worked for the BLM in the Farmington office during the 1990s and went from there to Montana, where the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center is located, and I was part of an interagency team that traveled around the country teaching people how to best steward wilderness. And when I retired, I came back down to the Four Corners because my wife and I just loved it here and ended up living just opposite Mesa Verde National Park, where the superintendent at the time had been a trainee of mine in the very last course that I did for the Carhart Center. And I asked him if there's something I could do as a volunteer for the park that would take use of my expertise. And through a series of things, the book came about.
Okay, so we left off talking last episode about the people involved in managing the park and how it went from sometimes pursuing private interest to the people who are involved in the Park Service and the Forest Service and all of these groups that are managing our public lands, for this really being a labor of love. It's not the most high-paying career path someone could go into, so you kind of have to love it and really be passionate and care a lot about what you're doing. And I would say that that is true for you. And for this project itself, it was also, you volunteered to do this. You wanted to dig into all of these files and learn about the history so that you could have something to suggest and give thoughts and ideas on for moving forward. So tell us a little bit more about the process of going through endless files, I'm sure, of spending time in the wilderness in the backcountry and everything that went into creating this.
Okay. The superintendent at the time, Cliff Spencer, asked if I might help with something called their wilderness character monitoring. Wilderness Act says that a manager must preserve wilderness character, but it doesn't explicitly say what that is or how to do that. And I had worked on a team, interagency team, for about a decade that had worked out a protocol for that. That's how it started. How can we measure wilderness character over time to know that we're actually preserving it? And then one of the things that the Park Service does is manage its areas that are recommended as wilderness that haven't been designated, manage those as though they were wilderness, and do wilderness character monitoring for them. And that brought to the fore the fact that Congress had asked Mesa Verde to do a inventory of their backcountry in 1976, and it hadn't been done yet. And so I said to Cliff, I'd be happy to do that. And I had done inventories on and taught how to do inventory for hundreds of thousands of acres in the BLM. And so I could do that for Mesa Verde. And I got the opportunity to go throughout the backcountry of Mesa Verde, which is closed to the public and closed to the staff unless they're on official business, doing an assessment for what areas that, in my professional opinion, I thought could be forwarded to Congress for possible designation as wilderness. And then to figure out why this hadn't been done and what areas had been designated as wilderness, because I had to go into the files and see how did we get from, 1906, where anybody could go anywhere, to, 1976 at the time of the wilderness designation, and the park going, we're designating wilderness, but no one can go there. And as I said, that is a unique. There are some other wildernesses that are closed to the public, and they're all small islands, either in the Pacific Ocean or there's one that's like 70 acres in Lake Erie. This is the only terrestrial wilderness that's closed to the public, and all those other wildernesses combined could have fit inside the smallest unit at Mesa Verde. So that's how I got into the backcountry and got into the library to look at the decision process. How did the park make that decision? And it fascinated me. the things that I found there, I just, oh, no one knows about this. I've just thought this would make a fascinating management history, because I'd read, the archaeological history, how the area had been lived, and how the front country had been developed over time. But there is no history of what happened in the backcountry. Wilderness almost never even gets mentioned in discussions about Mesa Verde. The fact that there is wilderness just appeared on the park map, not the location of the wilderness, but that there is wilderness, mentioned for the very first time in 2024. It lent itself to me to write about this process over time, how the stewardship of the backcountry and eventually the wilderness, how that changed over the decades.
Because you mentioned some of the park employees didn't even know that there was a wilderness area.
Yes.
It's so closed off and isolated.
I'm not sure if, I think probably the park employees today all knew that there was wilderness, but my good friend Jim Copeland was a ranger there the summer that Mesa Verde Wilderness was designated, and he did not know. And I talked with Mark Harvey about this. Now, Mark was the biographer of Howard Zahniser, who was the man who wrote the Wilderness Act. And Mark did not know that there was wilderness in Mesa Verde, which, isn't surprising, except he was a law enforcement ranger at Mesa Verde for 4 years shortly after the wilderness was designated. And he did not know there was wilderness there until I told him.
Wow.
So it was a secret. That's the secret part of the secret garden.
Well, at first, they didn't want to designate anything as wilderness.
Right.
Explain the reasons for that, because it is complicated. And as I was reading, I was like, well, yeah, I can see that side, but also
yes,
it makes sense for it to be wilderness too.
Yeah. Well, I think the main reasons that were given had to do with the difficulty of doing archaeological research in a designated wilderness, because you're not supposed to use motorized equipment. There are not supposed to be improvements there. Most of those, I think, grew out of the fact that the staff didn't understand that those could be approved if they were the minimum necessary for managing the area for the purpose of the Wilderness Act. And the real reason, I think, or let me say the valid reason, which is given very little attention in the documents, perhaps because it was insulting to the public, but a very real issue is that if we open this to people, they will steal what isn't nailed down. And that was certainly a more prevalent attitude, or a more prevalent fear, or perhaps a more justifiable fear back then. We're talking in the 70s. This is over 50 years ago. People appreciate the remnants more than they had. I think people are less likely to go, oh, look at this. This could look really nice on my mantle. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That still, of course, there will be. It still
happens today.
It still happens today, and
fewer.
It would happen. And the fact that it's fewer means it would take longer for everything on the surface to disappear. The question is, there are a couple of questions. Do you manage the area for the 99%? I'm making that number up. The 90% that visit with respect, or do you manage it for the 1% or the 10% who do not respect what is there? Who do you manage for? And then there is the greater question of what is the appropriate way to look at this land? Is it something that is to be preserved in perpetuity in as static a way as possible so that we see tomorrow what was there 50 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever, or 100 years from now, they see what we see today? Or are we just going to let it go? And if that means that somebody picks up a piece and takes it home, that's on them.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, and it's like 100 questions rather than one.
Yes.
And everybody's going to have slightly different views and opinions on that.
Yes.
But I think over the course of time, it has shifted more toward being respectful of the past, whether that means letting things decay as they naturally would or preserving for as long as possible. What do you think contributed toward public shift in how they viewed these sites from the days of going out there and collecting everything that they found and taking it home as souvenirs to that being fewer people who still do that. And most people do, I think, I hope, understand, like, you need to approach visiting these sites with respect for the past and the people who are still connected to it. I mean, it's like you thinking about someone's got an old outbuilding on their property. You wouldn't just go rummage through it and take whatever you want because you found it while you were walking around.
Yes.
But yet, that's viewed differently.
I don't know. I don't know how we got from there to here. What made people realize that's not yours. Just because it's out there, it's not yours. Just because you don't know who made that, or that person has nothing to do with you think, culturally, it's not yours. You just can't take. I don't know how we got there, because I mentioned in the book, back in the 1950s, there were places in town that would lend out shovels and buckets for you to go out and dig stuff. Not in the park. That was prohibited in the park, but they'd certainly go out in the monument, and it's like, we'll give you a map. Here, you might find some interesting stuff there. I don't know how we got from here to there. That's a really good question for a sociologist to answer. How do we get to the point where we honor not just the places, but the objects at those places as something that need to remain?
It seems like it's a cultural shift, like not just here, not in specific areas, related to preservation and conservation, not just physical things, but language, various aspects of culture, trying to better understand and reclaim some of those things that have been lost over time.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to see, particularly in this area, the focus on language, and with my students talking a little bit more about traditional culture that they're trying to learn more about and be involved in. And they don't really always know, because our culture, coming in as a conquering culture, so many of the native tribes had their language and their dress and their traditions not only taken away, but criminalized in some cases. Yeah. And so there's this big generation gap where that wasn't passed on. And now there's this interest in recovering some of that. And my random thoughts as I was reading, kind of wondering, if there's kind of, in a wider sense, where people who, live in areas with these wonderful cultural resources like Mesa Verde and Chaco and all of these places that we live so close to, seeing those connections be more valued and brought to the front and learning more about it. If it's an educational thing, if it's some sense of social maturity that we're reaching of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just destroy everything willy-nilly and, do whatever we want. Yeah. It's really interesting in this area particularly to see those shifts.
I think so. It's so rich. The variety of cultures is so rich here. And I think particularly with regards to what we call the Navajo, is this a function of them not living in cities for so long? But I remember when I worked here in the 90s, there were women in the office, and we had a Navajo affairs coordinator, Danny Charlie, that would have to interpret. There'd be some people who came in that did not speak English. They only spoke Navajo. I don't know if that exists now.
For some of the elders, yeah.
But it was a very enriching experience. I remember asking one of the women if they would teach me Navajo, and she said, "Well, it's a very difficult language, and you will leave here before you learn it." So the answer is no. And she was right. I was only there for 8 years. So, but you think of some of the other native cultures that suffered assimilation far earlier than the Navajo have, that getting the language back is very difficult, very difficult. And some places, we know those languages have been lost.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting thinking about the history of this area, the history of the park that you give and its management, and trying to understand all of the complex ways that everything is interrelated. You talk a lot about the park's interactions with and conflicts at times, and trying to navigate the Ute Mountain Ute reservation next to it. And as you mentioned earlier, that a big chunk of the park was taken from lands that had been designated as a reservation. And then you talk about trying to gain other areas of land and trade and go back and forth, trying to find ways to preserve sites, to have access to sites, or to gain access to those sites for the park, but then to not give access to the public for those areas of preservation. It's fascinating to read through this book and see the ideas of what one group views as a cultural resource that needs to be preserved, and what other groups, either the public or the tribe or another interest group, looks at as also a cultural resource, but it affects them differently, and so they see it and its management and its preservation differently.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So complex.
and differently over time. Mm-hmm. Just as it's inappropriate to think that all Native American people would think the same way about what's on the ground in Mesa Verde and how it should be managed. Looking at the way, say, the mountain Utes have thought about what ought to happen on their land adjacent to the park over time has changed. Mm-hmm. Different things have become important to those people. And so now they have their own tribal park that is south of Mesa Verde on the mesa, which is an astonishing resource. And 70 years ago, what they were hoping was that there'd be an oil and gas field there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the mineral resources and before grazing resources.
Yeah, to say that it's just inappropriate to be thinking that any person's or group of people's ideas are set in stone and are not capable of changing, and that those changes are valid.
Well, and as you progress through the book, you get to the last section where you pose some questions and you attempt to answer some of those questions, which a lot of them are not easy questions to answer.
Yeah.
But it gets people to start thinking about the future and moving forward and how things might change and how perspectives might shift, because it's not static. Even if we're talking about, preserving something for education or just to keep it there so people can see it, at some point that may not be physically possible and that might have to be adjusted. But looking at, the flora and fauna, and at one point they're kind of like, well, there used to be the bighorn sheep or the wild turkeys, and so should we bring them back? And that was really a challenging thing to try to do.
Yeah.
But there has been so much shifting, and the priorities are not always the exact same over the course of a few years at times. And then when you have these multiple groups all invested in the outcome, it makes figuring out what to do moving forward really difficult. But you attempt to take on some of that by answering some of the questions. So, thinking about the book, the project, the 7.5 years that you spent on it, you're moving in a forward direction and looking at what the future might hold. So how did you put together everything you learned and all of your thoughts and your opinions and every other perspective that you considered to be able to put forth some idea of what might be a path forward?
Well, that path forward, as you say, there are several questions that I asked there, and a lot of them don't have an answer. They have answers. And I think that a lot of that comes from having worked in the Four Corners for the better part of a decade and realizing that there are a variety of points of view and talking with people, who have an opinion about the land that, on the one hand, there are people that believe, no, we've got to set this area aside and keep it just like that for future generations, on one hand, and on the other hand, know that you're putting that land in a kind of limbo, a purgatory of place. And for it to be alive, we believe this land is alive. Things that are alive have to be allowed to die. So let it die. And I think I try to present both sides of that. I think at the end of the day, it's probably apparent that I come down on the let it die side. Maybe that's because I'm 75 and it's going to happen soon anyway. But going forward for the wilderness, speaking specifically about the wilderness or the areas of Mesa Verde that could be designated as wilderness, what does that mean? There are really three paths forward that I talk about in a path forward. There are three ways that this could go. One is we just keep on the way we've been doing it. It's worked more or less for over 50 years. We'll just keep ignoring the fact that there's wilderness. We'll just keep it closed to the public. And that's certainly the easiest, particularly now with, the cuts to personnel and budget. How can we possibly do more in the park when we have less to do it with? So that's certainly easy. The problem I see with that is it doesn't conform with the law. Mm-hmm. The Wilderness Act says that there shall be an outstanding opportunity for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Not that there might be if we let people in there. There shall be. There is an opportunity to get it undesignated as wilderness. Want to keep the area closed? Get it undesignated. That's never happened. There's never been an entire wilderness that has been undesignated. Parts of wildernesses have been, but never an entire wilderness. That doesn't mean that with this Congress and the present administration, there's an opportunity there that hasn't ever presented itself
Certainly a
in
lot
the
of
past.
Unique things that have happened.
Yes. And completely undesignating a wilderness might just be added to the list. I don't know. My preference, what I think needs to happen, which is the decision is easy, the implementation is difficult. Find out a middle ground, some way that other people can have an experience in the Mesa Verde wilderness, while at the same time protecting the irreplaceable cultural identity of that place, which is partially wrapped up in the things that are in the ground, but are certainly not solely the things that are on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I think there has to be a way forward, and I wrote out some, here are some ways that you could go about it, and the way to educate the people who are going to get a permit to go in there, because certainly would have to be by permit. You just couldn't open the door and let people go willy-nilly, which is what was the fear back in the early 70s when this was being discussed. Oh, people are just going to go wandering all around. Well,
and what happened originally before the park was designated,
absolutely.
People just went in and took whatever and did whatever.
Right.
And yes, we'd like to avoid that.
And they were, in fact, invited to do that, not to take things, but back by even in the 1930s, please go anywhere you want. There's nothing. The only thing you can't do, you can't go into a cliff dwelling without a ranger. The rest of the place is wide open for you to explore.
A good middle ground there.
I think there can be a middle ground,
but not opportunities to destroy or take things.
Yeah. I think we need to. A middle ground can be found, realizing that it's true. Not everyone will be respectful.
And that's probably going to be true forever, even if this continues to be something that people become more aware of and prioritize in their own personal viewpoints.
Yes.
There's always going to be the handful of people who are not going to abide by the rules or be respectful. But again, like you mentioned earlier, so do we close it for everyone because one or two people are going to behave inappropriately? If you think about if we did that in society with other things, we wouldn't have things. We wouldn't have any opportunities to do anything.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So hopefully, moving forward, even with things are kind of a little chaotic right now with public programs and funding and everything else. But this is definitely a resource that is important to so many people in this area and academically as well for the archaeology. Certainly, that's the first thing that stands out. But you talk a lot about just the natural resources in the park as well. Just those opportunities for learning more about it, especially if the decision is at some point to let some of the resources in the park naturally go where they're going to go, to have that opportunity for people to see it, to be a part of it, to study. It's sad to think that some of that is being missed out on because it's kept close to the public. If those eventually disappear, then so does the opportunity to be a part of it.
Yes, absolutely. There is there is something to be said about being there. And by there, I'm talking about the backcountry / wilderness of Mesa Verde. It is a moving experience. And in the book, I quote an acquaintance of mine, Faith Gemmel, who is a Gwich'in woman from northern Alaska. And I remember asking her about, I was interviewing her for a movie and was asking about, is this whole wilderness thing, is made up, quote unquote, made up by a bunch of old white men. And what do you think about that? And her response was, anybody can have the connection to the land if they are open to that connection. And I think that is certainly the case there. The connection might be easier if you are a Puebloan to have a connection with Mesa Verde. But anyone can have that connection if they're open to that connection.
And given access.
Yeah. Yes, and access. Yeah.
Well, even we've recorded for 2 episodes because this is something that I really felt like people in this area and broader would be very interested in and want to know. And we still have just scratched the surface of what's in the book. So there's definitely, I was fascinated reading it. There is some technical language in it, but I think overall it's very accessible. So not just for other Park Service employees who might be interested, for the average person who is interested in conservation and preservation and how our parks are run. It's really a fascinating read. I enjoyed it a lot. Do you have plans for other writing projects in the future?
No, I don't.
That's all right. This was a lot to get through for you.
Yeah, I'm old. I'm tired.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, you do have some plans for being able to interact with the public with book signings coming up in this area and other activities that you have planned. So tell us a little bit about your upcoming book signing in Farmington, and then if you have others planned as well, please feel free to mention those.
Well, I've done the ones in Cortez and Durango, so the one that's left in this area is here in town in Farmington at Quill and Quest, relatively new bookstore on West Main, 218 West Main, and I will be there on Saturday, June 21 at 1 o'clock. And I'll do selected readings from the book and then answer questions. And for those that want to buy a book and have it signed, I will have a pen.
Awesome. Well, and for people who maybe aren't able to attend in person, where else can they find the book and find you and reach out if they would like to?
Okay. Well, Quill and Quest will have extra copies. I think Amy's as well. People know Amy's a great used bookstore. I think they will have some copies as well, or certainly can get them. And if people want to reach out to me, they can at my email address, cvbarns@gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to not only come down and chat with me in person, which I don't get to do very often anymore. Most of the time it's on the phone. But for sharing your book and taking the time to chat for so long and really just dig into this really interesting, fun to talk about topic. I appreciate it.
DelSheree, thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me down here.
Thank you.